So, Moore reminds us that the long section that we've been talking about for the past couple of videos is merely a digression. It's a digression that was prompted by his first observation about the seven assertions with which he began his lecture. And that observation was that they were all contingent propositions. They're all contingent truths. That is, the things that he asserted, he says, are true, but there are things that could have been false. There are things the contraries of which, or contradictories of which, are not themselves self-contradictory, and what does and doesn't follow from that. And Moore goes into this digression about certainty, obviously. But what is his larger philosophical agenda here? I mean, to bring this thing back to maybe a question that we can relate to as being of, philosophical relevance. What is he trying to get at overall in this lecture? And it may be good to remind ourselves that as he says on page 268, that he chose those seven propositions because he thought they were good test cases. Well, test cases for what? So let's look at the second and third. Before we get to that, the second and third observation he makes about those seven assertions. The second one, which he begins on page 266, he says is that he was saying things like, if I said now that I am sitting down right now, that there is a doorway behind me, that I am wearing glasses, that the room I am in has a brown floor, or that there are pictures on the wall, that those kind of assertions, those kind of propositions, those kind of statements are not statements about my own mind or my own psychological state. They are statements about the world external to me, things that are not at all about my internal state, but what I observe in the world. So he says on page 266, in the case of every one of them, part at least of what I was asserting, in asserting it, was something from which nothing whatever about the state or condition of my own mind followed, something from which no psychological proposition whatever about myself followed. No, these were not things that were merely about my perception of the world or my internal state of consciousness and what I was internally, subjectively experiencing. No, these statements are about the external world. By saying that they were all of them propositions which implied the existence of an external world, that is to say, of a world external to my mind. Okay, so by making those ordinary statements, he was not describing himself or his internal state. He was describing the world. The third thing that he points out on page 267 about the seven assertions which he began was this, that for each of them he says he had the evidence of his senses. That is, he says there might have been other evidence, and there probably is other evidence that he could offer in support of those statements, which is not evidence from his senses, but that he did have evidence from his senses. He says, at the time when I made each, I was seeing or hearing or feeling things, or a combination of these, such that to see or hear or feel those things was to have evidence. Okay, so both these statements are statements about the external world and not statements about his own mind, and that these were statements for which he had the evidence of his senses. Now, these are kind of preliminary to his larger point, which is number 4.